So the last couple of things I want to touch on are civil society and the political economy, and also talk a little bit about the caste system. Civil society has, like you might expect, really risen with the falling dominance of the INC. So again, go back to liberation. When you have a major liberation organization, people tend to put all their, what do we put in? We put all our eggs in a basket. They tend to put all their eggs in that basket. And so they think, hey, this liberation organization represents us. And it takes some time for the liberation organization to really dirty its name to a certain extent and become much more commonplace. And so this is when you have the fall of the INC. And so you have increased activity of civil society. But during the INC's rule, in the post-war period, many decades, there wasn't this urgency to have a strong civil society. As a result, I mean, unions are still fragmented; they're still party-based. Business groups are there, but they're seen as corrupt. Peasants, again, it's a largely agricultural state, but peasants only occasionally make demands. They're very particularistic. They don't demand, macroeconomic change or anything like that. The most active and most influential groups have actually been communal groups. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Dalits. We'll talk about Dalits in a second, this outcasts group. And especially important has been the media. The media is really key in terms of civil society. It's a highly free media with radio and TV, especially important because of very low literacy rates. You're talking about around 40% illiteracy. Having all these radio and TV stations, it's hard to control with so many stations operating. So you've got a great free media in India. In terms of the political economy, the INC, as I mentioned a few times, focused largely on import substitution for a while and had very, very sluggish growth. They also launched the Green Revolution, which is important to know. They introduced new crops and new methods, making India one of the largest agricultural exporters. And so you had the gradual growth of the middle class. But from the 1950s and 1980s, again, it was a relatively slow growth. You had these Soviet-style economic policies, which I mentioned before when I talked about the INC, these 5-year plans, etc. A large state sector. Under Rajiv, in the 1980s, you had these neoliberal reforms. So the reason these came about was essentially you had all this regulation, this protectionism, high levels of state ownership, and this led to this sort of pervasive corruption and to this very slow growth. The 5-year plans of India resembled central planning in the Soviet Union. Steel mining, machine tools, water, telecommunications, insurance, electrical plants, all these other industries were effectively nationalized in the mid-1950s. So coming back to the 1980s, these neoliberal reforms were put in place precisely to reverse all this reverse slow growth, to accelerate growth. And it was, again, put into practice in part thanks to a technocrat who was in party because poverty, corruption, and slow growth were the path that people had seen. And so the reforms involved privatization of state companies. It became easier to license companies. They removed price controls. They reduced corporate tax rates so that people would invest. And you had huge growth. Growth more than doubled. You had around 6% growth per year. The economy now is dominated by the service sector. It's about 54% of the GDP. And agriculture, which is just around 28%, and then industry around 18%. Notice the difference, though, between advanced democracies' economic output and the economic output in India, where here 54% of GDP is in the service sector. In advanced democracies, we're talking about 75%. In India, we're talking about 28% agriculture. In advanced democracies, we're talking about significantly less agriculture, much less. Also note that you've got a 550 million strong labor force, which means cheap labor. Cheap labor plus an international language, English, there are between 300 and 400 million English speakers, means it's a home for outsourcing. It's a great place for outsourcing. In terms of poverty, I'll give you a little statistic here. In 2000, you had about 69 million 69 million fewer poor people than in 1979, so before the neoliberal reforms, but you're still talking about 25% living in poverty, with around a quarter of the world's undernourished people living actually in India. So huge strides made, but huge strides to go as well. The final thing I want to touch on is the caste system, and I'm not at all an expert on this, as I've mentioned several times, or meant to mention several times. The point of this class is to introduce you to some of these concepts and pull out sort of historical facts and things that you can make connections to between these various cases. It's an important skill to have so that you can make some sense of the world. But I'm not an expert in most of these countries. In fact, geez, I would call myself an expert, arguably in Russia and South Africa, out of the countries that we've covered, if I wanted to call myself an expert. And I don't really believe in experts, having been a reporter and talked to lots of experts. There are people who know a bunch of stuff about stuff, and so I'm one of those on cases that don't include India. But I want to introduce the caste system to you. At the top of the caste system, you've got what they call the Brahmins. These are teachers, scholars, and priests. Then you've got the Kshatriyas, the warriors, below them. Under them are the Vaishyas, agriculturalists and traders. And then you've got the Shudras, the service providers and artisans, down at the bottom. And then at the very bottom, you've got those who are technically outside the caste system, known as the Harijan, also known as the Dalits. These are the outcasts. An important thing to remember about the caste system, when you think about it today, is that we've seen forms of it in Europe as well. When we talked about feudalism, we were essentially talking about a caste system. There are historical advantages. And I use that in a really, really loose term. But what I mean is that from an evolutionary perspective, castes have, these sorts of systems have been instrumental in creating order in societies that are characterized largely by the entire system is characterized largely by mutual consent rather than compulsion, and it creates a system of mutual interdependence with a clear division of labor, which can arguably foster security within a community. That doesn't mean that the caste system is a good system. The feudal system wasn't a good system from a normative perspective, but it sets into work arguably certain expectations on the part of all sides, except from the Dalits, the Harijan down below, and they're the ones who have been most hurt by the caste system. And in fact, so the outcasts, the untouchables, are the Dalits, and this was actually challenged in the Indian Constitution of 1950, and untouchability was formally outlawed. You've got an affirmative action plan of sorts, which has brought untouchables into powerful positions. For example, Narayanan, who became the president of India in 1997, was an untouchable. The Chief Justice of India, Balakrishnan, also belonged to castes that were formerly considered untouchable. So within each one of these castes, by the way, there are numerous subcastes. And so that's what I mean when I talk about the Chief Justice having belonged to certain castes formerly considered among the untouchable castes. In reality, it's really hard to shed something like this. There's still periodic gang-related violence. There's social acceptance of certain aspects of the caste system, like you know who you can and can't marry. And so you can outlaw elements of the caste system, but it's very difficult to actually get rid of it once and for all. So that's it. We're going to stop with India, and I'll probably put up a discussion question or two about this. And so there we go. Over and out.